Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We've made it to the second half of the Forbidden Woods, where I'm doomed to get lost at some point, but as I wander around, I'd like to focus on getting to some unread item descriptions, starting with this one. Gunpowder Hunter Verification. A hunter verification produced by the Gunpowder Warehouse, known as Heretics of the Workshop. They had a particular attraction to complex mechanical structure and explosive power, and birthed strange weapons unlike any made in the workshop to that point. The Gunpowder Warehouse, now deceased, would boast, "You can't make good weapons if all you have are boring materials." So, the translation choices for this item that I find the most interesting are concentrated in that final set of lines, the ones concerning the saying or motto of the powder kegs. Actually, the translation of that particular word is the first point I'd like to touch on. The Japanese word here is usobuku, and it's somewhat unusual. My Japanese Daijisen dictionary actually gives me 5 different definitions here, though only one really makes sense in this context. Translated, it would amount to something like, to arrogantly make a bold proclamation, to boast. This is why my more literal version of the line is that the Gunpowder Warehouse would boast the concluding quote. The official translation goes with motto here, and I think this makes sense for a couple of different reasons. First, it's a reasonable extrapolation of the line. If you have a group of people going around making the same arrogant proclamation all the time, it's likely to be taken as that group's motto. Second, rendering the saying a motto means that it's easier to work the quote into the line stylistically. Japanese tends to incorporate direct quotations into sentences more than English does, and often one of the stylistic decisions that gets made in translation is to avoid translating these as is. Certainly, I think it makes sense to avoid a direct quote in the context of an item description, where it might come across as less formal than it should be. As for conveying the idea that this is a boastful statement, though, I think the way the whole line reads still helps get this across. By using the phrasing, bless their souls, it sets up an expectation that the following quote is going to be something irreverent. This also fits with the idea that the Powder Kegs were an unorthodox organization. So in terms of conveying the information of the Japanese, the official translation includes the idea that the Powder Kegs were an irreverent group that no longer exists, but had a common saying. Oh, and as an aside, I wanted to point out what I think could be an interesting play on words in the original Japanese. The very next definition for usobuku in my Daijisen dictionary translates to the howling of a beast or the crying of birds. I'm not sure how the translation team could have preserved this potential double meaning, but I thought it was worth pointing out in passing. Anyway, the final set of translation choices I wanted to bring up here actually concern the motto itself. And I've got mixed feelings on this one, because while I think the leap towards relatable phrasing they've made is justified, I'm not sure it ended up a strong enough statement given the setup. The idea that ordinary, boring materials won't add up to a good weapon is preserved in the line, if a weapon ain't got kick, it just ain't worth it. And I like the incorporation of the idea that the powder kegs are all about explosions, or big booms. But I don't think it sounds quite catchy or irreverent enough to be the motto alluded to earlier. Even a change to something as simple as, if a weapon ain't got kick, it ain't got nothing, seems to me like it could work better in that context. Again, I think the existing translation is reasonable, I just wish it had ended up a bit snappier. But enough on explosions and mottos for now. Let's look at this nightmare key. Lecture Hall Key. Key to the door of the lecture hall in the school building. The 2-story school building now drifts in the nightmare, but it is from when Bergenworth was a place of learning for history and archaeology. Perhaps even now the students wait in the lecture hall for their master. So, aside from certain regional differences, like using lecture theater instead of lecture hall, this is a pretty straightforward translation. But there's still one aspect of the official English translation that I think is worth commenting on. You may have noticed that the final line of the official English translation is actually longer than my more literal version, and it also takes a slightly different perspective. The original Japanese is purely speculative here, with the phrasing, perhaps even now, the students wait in the lecture hall for their master. It's tough to say whether there are students waiting in the lecture theater at all. In the official version, on the other hand, it's quite clear that the students are in the lecture hall. The phrasing makes it undeniable. Perhaps it still is, as the students in the lecture theater appear to await the return of their professor. The only question here in regard to the students is what they're waiting for. Also, having read that sentence in isolation, it seems obvious that it opens with a different subject than the Japanese line, continuing to speculate as to whether or not Bergenworth is still a place of learning. Now, these are small differences, but I find them interesting for a few different reasons. First of all, there's the question of hinting as to what's to come next in the game. As it turns out, the locked lecture theater in question is indeed swarming with students, all of whom are going to be enemies. Thus, the official translation makes explicit something the Japanese only hints at in terms of gameplay. Opening the door with this key is going to involve us facing a number of enemies. I happen to think this is a functional choice, and the hint is still subtle enough that even players who do read the description on this key might not understand the potential gameplay implications, but I thought it was a difference worth pointing out. Also, this seems like the kind of translation choice only someone familiar with what was going to be inside the lecture theater could have made, which is interesting to me from a translation perspective because translators don't always have access to that kind of information. This still leaves the shift in subjects to discuss though, and I think it's the result of an earlier translation choice that also deviates a bit from the original Japanese. There, it's clearly being pointed out that the lecture hall that's floating in the Nightmare is a version of the lecture hall from Bergenworth when it was a place of learning. It may or may not have anything to do with Bergenworth as it exists today. This is why my more literal translation reads, "The two-story school building now drifts in the Nightmare, but it is from when Bergenworth was a place of learning for history and archaeology." The official version of this line focuses a bit more on the former function of Bergenworth, without making it quite as clear that this Nightmare version is its own separate thing. Saying that Bergenworth may still be a place of learning is another way to convey some of that idea. I'm not sure the end result is entirely successful in recreating that distinction, but it's an evocative line in its own right, and I think the game as a whole does support the proper conclusion. But now let's look at some subtle distinctions in another item. Secret Medicine of Lead. Heavy, thick liquid medicine. Temporarily increases relative density, with the effect of making attacks easy to deflect, but it slows movement, and because it does nothing to alter defense, it's difficult to find a good use for. A mysterious medicine with a completely unknown production method, but according to one theory, it can only be born amidst nightmarish despair. Alright, I said I'd be making subtle distinctions, and that's what I'm going to do. And once again, I'd like to start by focusing in on the final line of the item description. Even more specifically, I'd like to look at the final two words of both the more literal and the official translations, which consists of the Japanese phrase, akumu teki na zetsubo. Literally, this is pretty straightforward. The noun akumu, or nightmare, which in Japanese is made up of first the kanji for bad and then the kanji for dream, is being modified by adding an additional kanji, teki, which serves to modify a noun into an adjective. In other words, it takes the word nightmare and turns it into the word nightmare-ish. And the reason I've gone into so much detail in explaining how I've arrived at the literal term nightmarish is because this particular set of words has some potential impact on our understanding of the world of Bloodborne. One of the theories that exists about the game is that what we think of as the real world, the city of Yharnam and the other places we can teleport to through the gravestones in the Hunter's Dream, is in fact nothing more than another dream realm. There are a number of things players can point to as evidence in support of this theory, but the point that's most relevant to this particular discussion is one of the locations in which we can find some lead elixirs. If we make our way over to the right of the cathedral ward, head past the houses where people are initially asking to be blessed with blood, get by the two executioners, and step into the entryway of the shrouded church, we can in fact pick up a number of lead elixirs. Now recall the final line of the English phrasing. The recipe for this mysterious concoction is unknown, but some postulate that it materializes only in the most desperate nightmares. So logically, if lead elixirs only materialize in the most desperate nightmares, and we can find the lead elixirs in the city of Yharnam, then that location is arguably within a desperate nightmare. Based purely on the official English, this logic makes perfect sense, but if you recall that the Japanese literally translates to nightmarish despair rather than desperate nightmare, it kind of falls apart. There's plenty of despair to go around in both Yharnam and the undisputed Dream Realms alike. Now, to be fair, this doesn't demolish the theory that Yharnam is another dream realm, and I don't think there's any way the translation team could have known some people might point to this item description in combination with an item placement and use it as evidence for interpreting the nature of the game's world. In fact, the translation team most likely had no idea what any of the item placements would end up being, so this is a case where, arguably, we're also seeing a side effect of the production process at work. But I do think it's interesting that once again, we're seeing a difference that even a slight change in 2 words can make. Of course, not every line of every item is going to be of tremendous lore significance. For an example of one of these cases, let's turn to our next item description. Molotov Cocktail with attached rope. A Molotov cocktail with a rope attached that is thrown behind and burns intensely. Allows one to fight in more unexpected ways compared to the regular one. As it was in the tragedy of Old Yharnam, there's a prejudice towards purifying the disease, and flames go along with beast hunting. Perhaps as a result, some types of beasts are said to have a sickening fear of flame. So we've already talked a bit about Molotov cocktails, and in fact the latter half of this item description, beginning with the passage concerning the burning of Old Yharnam and continuing to describe fire becoming a staple in beast hunts, is exactly the same as in the regular Molotov cocktail. And this, I think, is another opportunity to talk about some of the potential challenges of working within line and character limitations. I've talked about character limitations before and mentioned them even more frequently, since more often than not, they're something that has to be considered in any given game translation. But I don't think I've mentioned line limitations yet. These are also fairly straightforward in terms of concept. There's only so much space on a screen in which to display information, and when you have multiple lines of text being displayed, you can only fit so many lines of them on the screen from top to bottom. Of course, the room on the entire screen isn't generally the limiting factor. Both character and line limitations can vary wildly from one in-game context to another. For the name of a location on a gravestone in the hunter's dream, for instance, only one line of text is available, and none of the names listed are longer than 26 characters, with the longest ones, like Graveyard of the Dark Beast and Church of the Good Chalice, being exactly 26 characters long. Meanwhile, we have the item description screen. Here, the name of an item likely falls under different limitations, but the body of the description itself can be quite long. Note that while there are double breaks between some lines, others employ only single breaks. I'm not sure what the reasoning is that differentiates these 2 cases, but if the lines on the screen are any indication, it seems like any given item description can extend up to 11 lines. Though I suspect the actual limit is 10, because to my knowledge, none of the items actually have writing on the 11th and final line. So what does all this have to do with the item description of the Rope Molotov Cocktail? Well, it highlights an interesting translation challenge that may be coming into play here, related to the repeated text that I already noted. So it might seem like a translator has it easy when a section of the Japanese text is repeated word for word in another context. Sometimes this is true, other times the localization team will opt to avoid repetition for stylistic reasons, and sometimes, as might be happening here, it can lead to its own unique set of challenges. Because if you have to work within a certain set of character and line limitations, including the exact text for an existing translation that works just fine in its original context, can sometimes push another item description over the limit. In other words, the description of the Molotov cocktail may be adequately brief and convey all the information it needs to on its own item description screen, but add that same exact description to the Rope Molotov cocktail and maybe you suddenly need to trim down information. And if you do this, then you have a number of stylistic choices to make. Do you find the item description that takes up the most space, squeeze every character into place, and then copy the shortened version back into the briefer item description screen, or screens? If so, you may end up perpetuating awkward wording or leaving out information. Do you keep the copied text the same in the longer item description and pare down the additional information to make everything fit? Or maybe it would be better to work around the fact that the Japanese text is exactly the same in both descriptions by having the less restrictive item description contain a lengthier translation, while abbreviating it to fit into the context of the item description screen where you have less character space available. Each one of these decisions comes with a certain trade-off, and decisions need to be made about what is going to be preserved. You may have noticed, for instance, that my more literal translation of the Rope Molotov Cocktail included the phrase, "and burns intensely" in the first line, which the official translation seems to have shortened to "exploding." This is hardly essential information, and there may be another reason why it was changed, but with the official translation extending across 9 of what I believe to be 10 total lines, Perhaps it was deemed a worthwhile alteration in consideration of making this description fit into as small a space as possible. Again, I'm not sure what the exact reasoning was here, but I know I've certainly spent quite a lot of time reworking phrases like 5 or more to 5 plus for just this reason, and I thought it might make for an interesting topic of discussion either way. So hopefully you all enjoyed that bit of translator talk. I feel like I haven't done that for a while. Actually, if you have any thoughts on that, if you'd like to hear more about these types of nitty-gritty considerations, or if you'd like me to stick to the more typical translation analysis, please let me know. Of course, any other comments, questions, or suggestions would be welcome as well. Thanks for watching, everyone.